Welcome back. As promised, Martin George joins us on the Zoom line. We look forward, as always, to his perspective. This situation with the AG, Martin, and firstly, let me extend good morning and by all means, have yourself a great weekend.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Jason. Good morning to you, and good morning, Trinidad and Tobago. It's a pleasure to be here.
Indeed, good morning. Listen, this situation with the AG, we're getting so many different voices. Of course, the Law Association, the law fraternity is giving their particular take. Well, of course, the opposition, they're calling for his resignation. He would have come out to answer some questions, well, more or less, break his silence this week. What you thought of that particular press conference, that engagement with the media?
Well,
when you looked at it from your legal lens.
When you have a press conference which ends up raising more questions than answers, then you know that it is a very serious situation indeed. Basically, what we got out of the press conference was an admission of the mea culpa by the Attorney General. Now, that by itself does not exculpate. In fact, it tends to exacerbate the situation because it lends itself to more obfuscation than elucidation. And I'll tell you why. If it is that you are basically admitting that, yes, the information I put there was wrong, then the question arises as to how did you come to put that wrong information there in the first place? And you see, you end up sinking deeper and deeper into a quagmire, because if you then say, well, my memory failed me, it was 14 years ago, it was however long ago, and I couldn't remember clearly, then a question will arise, how then did you remember that you were just a junior and a note taker and you had a minor role? Because in other words, you seem to have remembered those things if you put them on affidavit. So the argument about your memory failing, it does raise questions because you did seem to remember those.
It seems like selective memory, but I want to find out, is it a common occurrence?
I still always like to be kind and polite, so I wouldn't word it that way, but all I say is it raises more questions than answers.
Well, I guess that's my interpretation there of what you just mentioned, because I'm trying to figure out, and again, you're a legal mind, is it common occurrence to forget details of a case, especially a big case? Obviously, I mean, lawyers do cases.
Well, I mean, the point is, Jason, I mean, particularly at the level, when one is functioning at the level of a top-notch and top-flight senior counsel, you are engaged in numerous matters over the years. History will be replete with, dozens and dozens of maybe hundreds of cases that you've done. So the prudent course of action, if one cannot immediately remember all the details, would be firstly to either try to consult the records or notes if you have any. If you don't have, then you see for other colleagues who may have been involved in the matter, you see what records and notes they have, and you use those as a reference. You try to get maybe the transcript of the proceedings. Sometimes even newspaper articles can be a reference source to say, well, okay, look, the matter was reported upon, and these were the roles that were played. And what I think is the turning point and the watershed moment in this matter is the issue of when did you become senior counsel? Because that's a matter of public record. That's not something that is secret. That's not something that is closeted. I mean, if you recall the Privy Council case, from 1936, Ambad versus Attorney General, where the justices of the Privy Council said justice must not be a cloistered virtue. So the same way you becoming senior counsel, it's not something that's cloistered or hidden. It's something public. You were celebrated and feted and, treated royally and lavishly. People heaped praise upon you. So that moment is not something that you could ever be doubt about. And if you were senior counsel at that time, then it begs the question as to how then does one move from that to describing oneself as junior and a note taker? That's not the role of a senior counsel. People don't pay senior counsels to be a junior or to be a note taker. So, I think that there are still many questions swirling around. I mean, it's a very unfortunate circumstance because, those of us who know the AG personally and professionally know of, his sterling reputation, for the years of practice.
Yeah.
And of course, mistakes do happen, but depending on the gravity of the error, one may have to man up and take some sort of responsibility for it. And it may eventually result in you having to do the honorable thing.
And the honorable thing in this regard will be to step aside and resign, because the reality is, you would have said it, many would have said that Mr. Moore is a legal luminary, a legal superstar. So it begs the question as to the rookie errors that is playing out in the public domain. As far as you're concerned, if you get an A with him, what will be your advice? Should he really take heed and yield to I guess, the detractors and those who are asking for him to step aside?
I don't want to be so presumptuous as to think of myself as advising him, but what I would say is, in the circumstances, it would appear that this is not something that is going to go away. You see, the opposition has already taken a course of removing themselves from Parliament every time he gets up to speak. I mean, of course, the nation may soon tire of that approach. But the fact of the matter is, this is an issue that is going to bedevil your stewardship forever. It's always going to come up. It's always going to be raised. It's always going to be a hurdle and a stumbling block. And even from the perspective of the government and the good of Trinidad and Tobago as a whole. So sometimes you have to look beyond your own narrow personal interests and, of course, your pride and your ego, which, of course, must have taken a major bruising in the circumstances. But one has to pick oneself up, look beyond that, and think of the good of the country as a whole, the good of the nation of Trinidad and Tobago, the good of the people. Is it good and proper for one to continue with such a cloud hanging over you unresolved? And that's the issue. So, I mean, admitting it doesn't resolve it.
Yeah.
You know, all that admitting it does is make it easier to say, well, okay, so what next?
Well, I would
Having
imagine
admitted it, what next?
Well, I would imagine it's turning into political football. It is there already. The games are playing out in the public domain, and I would imagine if he was to truly take heed of the advice of, I would imagine, colleagues and even bend and yield to the opposition's demand for him to resign, that in itself will be a political victory, more or less, that can be used on the campaign trail, can be used favorably from the opposition side.
And you know, Jason, that's the thing, you see, and that's why shows like this are important, where you as a host and I guess guests who are objective should stand up and call out our politicians to show a level of maturity. This actually ought not to even be a political issue. This is supposed to be a nationhood issue, a state issue, a Trinidad and Tobago issue. This is not about scoring political points or feeling that, well, if your Attorney General resigns, then you've lost political points and you've lost political face. This is a matter where both sides are supposed to show that level of maturity of putting country first, putting nation first, and saying, hey, listen, okay, a slip-up was made, an error was made, it is not good for Trinidad and Tobago. But could you imagine at any international forum or any regional forum, they usually have meetings of attorneys general, either Commonwealth, or you have maybe CARICOM, or, internationally. And if someone brings up this issue, it's going to be an international embarrassment. So it's not something that we as a people should rejoice or revel in, regardless of your political persuasion. It's not something to feel happy about. We ought to all feel some sense of collective concern for Trinidad and Tobago. So, I would call on both sides of the House to show that level of maturity, that level of political maturity, so as not to make it a political football, but to try to make it a Trinidad and Tobago issue, to say, well, look, this happened, and it's not good for the nation for it to remain as a stain, a blemish, a black mark against us as a country. And therefore, we ought to take steps, do the right thing, and in doing so, we ought not to be dancing on anybody's grave in the process, and, rejoicing and trumpeting this as a political victory. It's not. It's an embarrassment for Trinidad and Tobago, and it's something that we all ought to try to deal with in a mature, reasonable, rational way.
Well, when we look at it and we analyze that the Prime Minister, who would have obviously had a major role in the appointment of this new Attorney General, he's out of the country. Page 7 says to us this morning he's doing extremely well. He will return home shortly. Do you anticipate upon his return, this is a must-address scenario? He can't avoid this. He will have to talk to the nation comprehensively about this issue.
Well, Jason, you and I are doing this interview. I am not physically in the studio. In fact, I am not even physically in Trinidad at the time that we are speaking now. So even to say for him to wait till he returns, of course, subject to medical clearance for, I guess the reasons why he is out of the country. But once his doctors clear him to be able to even conduct a Zoom meeting or a Zoom interview such as you and I are doing, I think that the Prime Minister has a duty and a responsibility to the nation. And not just that, you ought to show that level of respect to your citizens, to say, well, look, I am going to address this. That's why we elected you, and that's why we put you in leadership. Leadership is about sometimes taking hard and difficult decisions, even though they may not be popular, even though you may not win or score points. But you are supposed to be man enough to be able to stand up, face the music, and say, hey, listen, this happened. It's not good for it to continue or for it to remain as a stain and mark and blemish on the nation. So therefore, I am going to take decisive action. We deal with it. And that's why I'm also calling upon the opposition to show that level of maturity also, so that they don't behave like, little school children and, you're laughing and, you're saying, Johnny got licks and ha, ha, ha. Come on. We need to grow up as a nation and move beyond that type of puerile, petty, immature behavior that we sometimes see displayed in our parliament.
Indeed. As we look at the bigger picture here now, the actual case, it's one of the biggest white-collar crime cases in the country. Some big personalities involved, and obviously after all these years, there is still no judgment. I'm trying to figure out here now from the legal perspective, with the AG's missteps, with that whole, I would say, the shenanigans that took place there. Could this ultimately cause this case to fall?
Well, I think thus far, from what I've read in the media and the newspapers, it appears that the judge in Miami took swift, decisive action. And I think he probably took the correct steps to safeguard the process and the proceedings. So I think based upon his intervention and his decisions, I think the process has remained sacrosanct and intact. So in terms of those proceedings in that Miami court, I don't think that the fallout is likely to affect the integrity of those proceedings. And I think that's because the judge took those steps to safeguard and, basically insulate the proceedings from any risk of anyone saying, well, look, I am prejudiced by someone who may have advised, instructed, represented me, and who would have taken my instructions, who would have been privy to my innermost thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and my innermost confessions in relation to this scenario, who is now on the other side, basically almost prosecuting or in a role where you are, representing the state of Trinidad and Tobago against the individual. So I think the steps taken by the judge ought to be sufficient, at least in this regard, to allow those proceedings to continue successfully.
Thanks for that, because I was really trying to look at the bigger picture, because I will obviously, and myself and the nation will want to see this case, come to its natural conclusion with some kind of judgment, because again, white-collar crime, yes, the focus, we look at the criminality from the standpoint of violence and what's happening on the ground, but when crime is committed with the pen, we must, folks must be held accountable. Because I always tell people the pen is just as powerful, or sometimes more powerful than the gunner.
Yes, and just to put it in context, let's not forget that 2 of the American co-conspirators were convicted several years ago. They served their time already, long time, so, I mean, in terms of the way those matters were handled and processed, they were dealt with rather, efficiently. The matters in Trinidad and Tobago are still, I think, languishing, and, making their way at snail's pace through the court system.
Yeah. Martin, I sometimes wonder if that is intentional, but that's a different conversation for our next day.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is.
Martin, have yourself a great day. Always great talking with you, and an even better weekend.
And a wonderful weekend to you all.
Yes, for sure.
Thank you.
That's right. We come back. Trinidad and Tobago, I tell you. Never a dull moment, huh? We're going to come back and get some details from the St. Mary's team. All the St. Mary's old boys feel proud this morning. It's back. Dining with the Saints. Details after the break.